Thank you all for being here. Today we have the chance of having Oskar Broberg with us, presenting a book that was a collaboration. So vad har ekonomisk historia? And the book, so what is economic history is can be a pedagogical tool also. So he will introduce a bit that. And it's a collaboration with many people from the department. So Shestin was one of the co-editor. And there are, I looked at the list and it's like many of the researchers from the different discipline also inside of our department. So the different kind of branch of economic history, which makes it quite good to answer the question of what economic history is. There is the diversity that is there with Martin Dreib and Anna from more demography side, and Astrid Kander and many of the scholars. So it's quite a nice answer also to the end of the last seminar that finished a bit with the question of what is economic history, to which we had some metaphors to describe what it could be, and a nice discussion. So just also a kind of administrative point. So the next seminar will be on December 6th, and it's going to be Martin Anderson who will present on Myrdals. So there is also this kind of willingness to present some of the economic historians in the seminar series. So this is the theme for next seminar. And so the format for today, Oskar will present for 30 minutes, and then we will have 30 minutes discussion. Hopefully by then we are finished with eating, so yeah, we can talk. And yeah, I think that the discussion is kind of an important part, because there is I mean, now it's online, but this is really aimed to stimulate discussion, this seminar. So it's going to be quite a good format also to kind of feed in with ideas and then have a time for discussion. So Oskar, if you want to start, you can.
Yes. Let's see. So Clara, you see the presentation now? Good. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation, the possibility to visit you, although digitally, to talk about our book that, as I said just before, that the books tend to have a longer prehistory than you imagine. But then, of course, we don't know how long history it will have forward. Time will tell about that. But I chose the title for today, What is Economic History, which of course is the title of the book, but also a subtitle, How to Use a Textbook Project to Further a Conversation. And I will try to explain what I mean by that, because it goes to a little bit the diverse ambitions to this project, and which I also make this seminar very nice to participate in, because I think that is an important part of all book projects, to try to participate in different kinds of conversations. And what I will do is that I will talk a little bit about how the book came about, and also a little bit about of course the content of the book. But I will actually also say just a few words when I, because I know some of you, but not all of you very well. So I will make a little bit also a presentation of myself, because I think that is actually, it's a way of also expanding on to answer the question of what is economic history, and that it can go in different directions. So I will use myself as a little bit of a case study to exemplify that. But I will start with, you see the questions there, and it was actually the prehistory of the book was that I was participating in the economic history meeting in 2017, and I was listening to one of the keynotes, and it struck me that, and this was 16 years after I attended my first economic history meeting in 2001, and it struck me that the discussions were very good in 2017, and some of the conflicts between different genres, as I prefer to call them, of economic history was not heavy conflict, but rather that people actually were talking over what could have been seen as sort of boundaries within the field of economic history. And I was very happy with that. And I saw that talking about theories and methods don't have to be like a tug of war, but rather as a good academic discussion. So I went out after the keynote in the coffee break, and there was Erik Rehn from Studentlitteratur, editor, and I didn't know him, but I walked up to him and I started to talk to him, and I said that this is really nice, and I think maybe we should actually do something about this. And then he said, well, it's an excellent idea. Why don't we make a book about economic history? Maybe that's needed. And I said, yes, I think that would actually be a good idea. And then he showed me a book that they made in economics that was called Questions of Economics. And we used that sort of as a benchmark to discuss what kind of book can we write about economic history, where we invite different authors to write, but still think about what's the coherent thing that we want to make out of this? What's sort of red thread? And one starting point there was that compared to economics, economic history, though it's a much smaller discipline, if we count the numbers of economic historians compared to economists, we have a broader base and a wider methodological toolbox actually than economics, which, I mean, the strength of economics is that they have a maybe smaller toolbox in one sense, but also tighter. And that made it quite logic to make a book that was called the Questions of Economics, and they all departed from more or less the same toolbox. Whereas we turned it around talking about economic history to say that why don't we write a book where we emphasize the variety of ways of writing economic history, but where we will still start with what are the questions that students might bring in when they start reading, when they are choosing to study a semester or 2 or 3 or 10 years of economic history. What can be seen as starting questions? And we met, well, first we put together an editor team together with Kerstin Enflo, Kristina Lilja, Rodney Edvinsson, and Lena Andersson Skog. And we, together with Eric, had a first workshop where we scribbled down, okay, what could be the questions that students to economic history bring with them? And they were questions like, why is the living standard higher in some countries? Is economic growth compatible with sustainable development? What role does trade play for economic development? Are financial crises inevitable? So we try to keep them fairly simple and say, okay, if students have these kind of questions, what kind of book would be worthwhile writing, where we not necessarily give an absolute answer to these questions, but at least show that economic history is an academic discipline where you can actually wrestle with these kind of questions. And you can use different kinds of theories and methods in order to engage with these questions. So that was the start. And once we had done that, we made another sort of little workshop where we said, okay, what kind of themes or genres of economic history would then be good. And we didn't want to say that these are the only ways to write economic history, but what kind of themes and genres of economic history is researched today within the departments of economic history in Sweden. So that was sort of a delimitation, saying that we wanted to present what kind of research is going on, and what questions do researchers in the departments of economic history in Sweden today wrestle with, and how can we make that interesting and intriguing for students during their first semesters of economic history. And I will come back a little bit more to how that developed. But before I do that, I'll just, again, since I don't know all of you, I'd say just a few words about myself. My name is Oskar Broberg, and I present myself as a business historian with a financial twist without the number crunching. So I would say that most of my research projects have some sort of business history connection. So I started out writing about the incorporation process in Sweden and the development of financial markets, modernization of Swedish financial market and Swedish venture capitalism in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And then I got to work with these beautiful old joint stock company letters. So they were there in the archives, very beautiful. And this was, of course, many of the sort of genius companies of Swedish industrialization that were born at this time. This is from Alfred Nobel's Nitroglycerin Aktiebolaget. And that was my PhD. And after that, I slipped into more contemporary projects. So I wrote about the globalization of finance during the 80s and 90s with a focus on derivatives and derivatives exchange. So these are Myron Scholes and Fisher Black, the developers of the Black and Scholes option pricing formula, and how these ideas was brought into Sweden by the new private stock exchange in the 1980s. So the finance was an important part of it. And then I also got into advertising history. So Zlatan scored his goal for Paris Saint-Germain. He took off his shirt and it looked like he was tattooed all over his torso, but actually he was just an advertising signpost for the United Nations projects for helping poor children all over the world. So, and writing about financial derivatives and then about advertising in the same period, the 1980s and 90s, on the one hand, they were very different kind of areas to write about, but there were a lot of similarities, and more of these similarities became very clear to me in the last year when I started to become interested in cryptocurrencies, which to me is sort of the perfect storm between financial innovation and innovation in the media landscape. So in order to understand why Elon Musk is the richest man on earth, you have to know something about finance and you have to know something about advertising, because he's the perfect mix of the two. But you don't have to know much about electric cars, but because his richness is not so much about electric cars. And so this is a little bit what I've been doing. And as I said, it's not so much number crunching. Yes, I was counting the joint stock companies when I was doing my work on incorporation process. But then what has interested me a lot with the finance part is that most of the studies in finance is doing a lot of number crunching. But when you look at the effects of finance in society, a lot of the effect has not so much to do with numbers. And when numbers are included, they are mostly there as rhetoric. So in order to get a sort of a larger grip on finance, you have to also put finance in a wider context. And since I know that, I mean, the Department for Economic History in Lund is, as you are well aware of, is very large in the international comparison. Some say it's the largest department for economic history in the world, and that you are in that sense also actually part of defining what economic history is. For me being from the department in Gothenburg, we often refer to Lund when we also talk about high standard of quantitative economic history. So my presentation here is also a way of furthering the discussion of how we can put all these different kind of genres into economic history, where quantitative economic history is one part of it and a very important part of it, but also not the whole story, of course. And just to further that example one step more, I will show one of my favorite business historians, Per Hansen, who wrote an article in 2012, which was called Making Sense of Financial Crisis and Scandal, a Danish bank failure in the first era of finance capitalism. And Hansen's point of departure is really how to think about how we can make use of narrative analysis to understand financial crisis. And his point of departure is the Nobel laureate. Well, I guess they're both laureate, both Akerlof and Schiller. But I was thinking of Schiller here because he also wrote a book about it. What if stories themselves move markets? The stories no longer merely explain the facts, they are the facts. And what Per Hansen is doing in this article is to analyze the Danish financial crisis, which was actually quite similar to what happened in Sweden at the same time in the wake of the First World War around 1920. And Emil Glückstad was the charismatic CEO of Landsmannabanken in Denmark, and they were expanding very rapidly up until the deflation crisis in 1920. And what Hansen does in his analysis is to see what kind of narratives were circulating in the Danish society around this financial expansion and what happened with these narratives in the crisis. So what he says then is that I argue that bubbles and the responses to crisis are driven by narratives that compete about assigning meaning to the events. Over time, one narrative will become dominant. Some consensus or dominance will be formed about what meanings to ascribe to the crisis, and the sense-making process will stabilize. So he's then saying that, yes, of course, the numbers behind this financial crisis is important, but if we are to understand the full effects of the crisis and the political outcome of this crisis, then we must also study how this narrative evolves. And then he points out to three narratives that were competing in the Danish society in the early 1920s, and that the revolutionary socialist one lost out, and also that the structural one about the failure of politics also lost. And the one that won was the one where you would point fingers to Emil Glückstad and some more greedy bankers, because that was the narratives that could be formed about, and then also that was able to transform into not reactionary policy, but a policy that could find political consensus in the Danish system. So that is just sort of one example of the type of broad base that we wanted to capture in this book. And it's not that I wanted that this would be a very important part of the book, but we wanted looking for authors who could capture their different genres of economic history, coming from a quite variety of different entry points. So the book then, as I said, it was Lena Andersson Skog from Umeå, me from Göteborg, Rodney Edvinsson from Stockholm, Kerstin Enflo from Lund, and Kristina Lilja from Uppsala, who formed the editor team. And we decided to have 3 introductory chapters. So the first, and these introductory chapters we wrote together. And I would really say that I mean, of course, we were not sitting by the computers together, but we were really molding the chapters together. Kerstin can have the possibility later to say something about that if she wants to. But we were having these chapters going back and forth. The first one talking about the development of the discipline of economic history. Quite a lot, it's a story on the development of economics and history, of course, up until the 1950s. And then the more broad entry into the Swedish university system from the 1950s and onwards as a subject in its own right. And then 2 chapters, one on theories and one on methods. And we are not thinking that we have written like a handbook in theories or methods, but again, 2 chapters that want to introduce basic students in economic history to how can we start thinking about theories when it comes to the phenomena in history that we want to study. So introducing structural analysis or Schumpeter on entrepreneurship, and different entry points to both quantitative and qualitative analysis. And this was not very, I mean, it's a challenge to find the right level here. And I think time will tell whether students actually find it useful. But we were quite clear that we wanted to keep all the chapters fairly short, and that it was not really any idea to make these theoretical or methodological expositions very long, because they are better explained clearly in other types of book, but still pointing to students in the directions. And then we have 10 genres, and I will in just a minute say something about them. But there are, of course, many more potential themes, such as agrarian economic history, gender, history of economic thoughts, all very important, and there could be many more. But we had to limit ourselves, and some of them, like parts of agrarian economic history, and I would say also gender and history of economic thought, we were partially covering them in the chapters that are there. And then, of course, it was also a balance walk between like a Swedish perspective and international perspective. I saw just last week that there was a note on the book in Scandinavian Economic History Review, where Paul Tonstad Sandvik from Norway wrote a book, and he was very generous in his writing. But he pointed to that there's a lot of international parts in the book, and also quite a lot about Sweden, not so much about the Nordic context. And of course, that is also, it's always when you write a book like this, you have to make some limitations, but that is something that, of course, could have been more emphasized as well. We were 5 editors, as I said, and then 25 authors in total, meaning that the specific chapters were 10, and there were, we put together a pair of authors, so 2 authors for each chapter, and we, for most of the chapters, there were also, these authors came from different departments. So that was actually sort of a risk-taking in the project, that we early on said that let's make this sort of to a national project and put together people who have not necessarily worked before, but that we know that they know a lot about this specific, whether it be environmental economic history or structural transformation or so. And in the end, it worked. We kept the deadline. So Eric at Student Literature was happy with that. And we said all along the ambition here was not really to write a book that said, this is economic history, ! But really, what is economic history, ? Meaning that the ambition was all the way to further many different discussions on what economic history actually might be. So that includes that the hope is that it could be used for basic courses in economic history, but also actually that it might be read by researcher and senior persons in economic history to also, like in seminars like this, to also talk about what is economic history, where does it come from, and what could it be. So very brief, the 10 chapters. We have first industrialization and technological development. We used it because the Industrial Revolution is quite often seen as sort of the big bang in the area of economic history. And we had Malin Nilsson, originally from Gothenburg, but now in Lund, and Jonathan Svanlund, who wrote that chapter. And then we have one on growth and structural transformation, environmental economic history, demography, wages, inequality and distribution, the state, the firm, finance, and trade. They had slightly more elaborated titles in Swedish, but I made like a short summary of what they were about to show you, give you flavor of the different areas that we covered. So, for example, we choose not to have one article that would say sort of business history and this is business history, but rather try to keep it quite concretely for a new student. This is different areas that we can learn about when studying economic history. And finally, then how to use the book. Of course, when you write a book like this, and also in Studentlitteratur, who it's really aimed at reaching to students, that was of course the basic ambition of it. And then the question arises: does it fit in our basic courses in economic history? And from what we can tell now, after a little more than a year, we can say that yes, it seems like it's been started to use in some different departments. In Gothenburg, we now have it on our basic course, and the way we have used it, and of course it depends a little bit whether your courses are structured chronologically or thematically from the beginning. In Gothenburg, our first semester of economic history, if you study it as a freestanding course, this is still fairly chronological, but we realized that we could actually use this to sort of make some entry points also to emphasize for the students how we, even if you study it chronologically now, there are of course important themes that run over the chronology. So for example, we used the chapter by environmental economic history to when we talk about the development during the 20th century and how this discussion comes into this societal debate, but is also part of actually reshaping the academic discipline of economic history. So we found it quite useful both to start to make the students thinking about the themes in economic history, but also starting to get to see the discipline in itself. Well, then of course it's also a question about how does the field of Swedish economic history fit in when compared to the rest of the world? Because as I said in the beginning, the starting point for our project was that we were using authors and an editor team from Sweden, and also departing from mostly the kind of research that were conducted in Sweden. But of course, most research today are doing international research in different ways. So it's not that Swedish in that sense. But I also think that it's an issue of how do we view Swedish economic history when we look at the rest of the world? Because though we are a small country, we also know that we have a fairly strong tradition of economic history in Sweden that I think we should be proud of and that we should try to develop. So in that sense, I don't think we should just sort of mirror the world, because that would be one way of discussing it. Are we representative of how the world looks like? I think we should be even a little bit more bold than that, say that, no, this is also how economic history should look like. It should be this variety. It should include all these different kind of theories and methodologies. Because when people are talking about, okay, but where to study economic history, and they could be anywhere in the world, we know now that a lot of people are applying for the master programs in Lund. We also know that when Gothenburg is releasing places for the PhD programs, we have applicants from all over the world. And I think when we know that, then we should also, we need a lively discussion of what the subject is and should be, and not just like a reflection of the world, but also in sort of a performativity sense, saying that this is what we want it to be. Yes, that was my presentation.
Many thanks. And it's a great question also to open the discussion with. Thank you so much for your presentation and for keeping in time also. So I will invite the floor for a question. You can also write it in the chat if you prefer. So if there is already some questions. Maybe I have, oh, okay, Sasha, you have one.
Yeah, thanks for the interesting presentation. I hope I didn't miss that part, but when you were talking in the beginning about these kind of questions, you know, you were sitting down to wonder like what questions might students have when they come into this course. Did you ask students as well, or did you just reflect upon it amongst the teachers?
Well, both. We were, since the editor team has a big experience of teaching, so I would say that we brought it in that way. And actually in Uppsala, they had made like a questionnaire along from students. So indirectly, but we did not invite students to be part of the workshop. No, we discussed on our own.
All right. Because yeah, I'm always wondering, if I may follow up on this. Now I was wondering, I teach mostly in development studies, then economic history parts, and there it's always difficult to really find out, you know, what kind of questions do they actually have coming in, not really selecting economic history on their own, and then yeah, trying to figure this out. But it gave me the idea of perhaps just asking them next year to see how I can connect that perhaps better to economic history. I think that's a challenge for the discipline in general, I guess, to like be more relevant outside of just people with an interest in economic history.
I think that's an excellent idea, and please let me know what their questions are to see if our hunches were roughly right or not. Because I think that's, I think it's extremely important when you are developing teaching to actually know where are the students coming from and what kind of questions do they actually have. So I think it's a very important starting point, because sometimes you will actually realize that they're not at all where you think they are.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Super. Mats, you have your hand up. If you want, you can ask the question.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for an interesting presentation, Oskar. And I think many thoughts come to my mind here, but I have just one question. That the theme of today's lecture is what is economic history. So can you say that in one sentence now?
Yeah.
Yeah. You have written a book about it, and you have worked with it now. So what is economic history, Oskar?
I think economic history is a true interest in the complexity of history, because when we had the discussions in the group, and it was quite clear that we were researching in the editor team different fields using different theories and different methods, where we were what I think we will find our common ground, and where we were also talking of when we were trying to delineate it from sociology or economics or otherwise. It's really how do we talk about a common ground that is history is very complex, but can still form a basis for understanding for where we are today. And that might seem like a truism, and it might maybe now that we're in a room with economic historians, that might seem like self-evident. But I think it was actually quite clear when we talked about why the Industrial Revolution. There are all different fields that are interested in technological development. But how can we agree on in economic history that the Industrial Revolution is so important, and that it's something that develops over time? Then I think the the variety of history is a very important starting point, because that also points in the direction of, no, we cannot understand it with one tool because of that variety, and also pointing in the direction of sources. These two, because that I think also became quite clear in the discussion of when we were writing the methods, that yes, we can think quite differently about methods, but we were in agreement about being careful with our sources. And Kerstin, please help me out with defining economic history.
Super hard. I think to some degree, I think you pointed towards something that we had a really good discussion about, and sometimes heated in our group. So we could agree on that we have different methods. We wrote separate parts of the methods chapters, one quantitative and one qualitative. Although they were separate, we still agreed on, okay, these are our frameworks. And we were all super clear on that we care about sources. But one thing, and I'm sorry for bringing this up, but I think it's important, that we didn't really agree on was how we use theory. And I think maybe this is something that is a debate within economic history that I don't think we can solve. And I think all of you that are here are also participating in defining economic history. But I just wanted to say to you, or to take the discussion forward, that we had a discussion about to what extent we form our own theories and to what extent we approach our subject empirically with theories from other fields. And I think this is just an ongoing discussions where we took various approaches. My personal stance is that we have our own theories, and that we also deal with theories that sometimes we adopt one theory for one period and then we can use another theory for another period. And that's how we maybe as economic historians would define it. But we didn't agree in the group, and I don't think we will agree. And I think you can maybe spot it in the chapter too. I'm not sure if it translated into the chapter, but this is, I think it's an important question in how we define economic history, but not easy to solve. So I'm not sure if I helped you out or if I just made it even worse.
No, that was good, because I think that for me, what was really fruitful about the project was that, yes, we managed to reach some sort of common ground. If we hadn't, it would have been painful. But at the same time, it's just as Justin said, it was not like, oh, we just sat down and everybody thought sort of this is the same and this is economic history. But yes, we had our disagreement throughout the project and even when it landed, so that actually in the very last round, I told Elric that, no, I will only have a look at the last version of the first chapters.
I can say that Oskar was a true diplomatic resource in this project. So we managed to land a book in the end, yes.
But I would like to just get it back to Mats, because I'm interested in your questions, and do you how do you think about it?
I would say that I have lots of thoughts about that, but I think we should take it. I will wait until Marcus, Ellen, and Sacha has talked, because they. So I will come back.
Yes. If there is maybe a quick reaction to what has been said, if I don't know if you all have a kind of a direct reaction to what it is before we change maybe question or topic. It's all a bit connected. So Marcus, if you want, you can go first.
Yes, once again, very good presentation. So you seem to be somewhat in agreement of like, where's the starting point of economic history? But then what is the end point? Like, what is the outer limit of what is economic history? And what is the relevance in, or what does it give us to actually delineate ourselves from history in general? Why is it important that we specify that we are economic history and not history? And what difference does it actually make?
My spontaneous answer to that is I think that it's beneficial to look at our field as like a living organism, and the living cell is semi-permeable. That you need some sort of border in order to talk about an entity, and so I think in that sense the inner shell is maybe more important than the outer where we sort of end talking about ourselves as economic historians. But we need some sort of common ground, I think, for two reasons. First of all, because We need to be able to give some sort of answer to Matt's question. I mean, intellectually, what is economic history? And for me, I think I land pretty much about in sources and complexity of time, and the complexity of things that evolve over time. For me, these are two important basic that I feel that when I'm invited as a commentator to sociology, then I can rest assured in my historical understanding of things. And they think that I bring something to the table. But I also think that it's actually important because we live in a time in a institutional context where we need to be able to define our subjects to make it relevant within the university system. So we also need to be able to talk about it in order to sort of why we should be in existence. And for me, both of those point to the direction of yes, it's important to formulate some sort of common ground and core. But that said, I think it's just as important to encourage PhD students and researchers to go out and not stay within the confinements of this sort of idea of a common platform, but rather to engage in all this. And I feel it very much now when I've come into the discussion of cryptocurrencies. And everybody I talk to say that, whether it's professors in accountings and whatever, they said, oh, I know nothing about cryptocurrencies. And I said, you have to. This is going to change the infrastructure of global finance. You have to know something about it. And we historians can offer some things. We can give viable comparisons to the gold standard of the 1890s. So in that sense, I think we need to develop or further our double identities of an inner platform and outer, if that was some sort of an answer. I don't know.
Great. Thank you. And Ellen, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, it's not really a question. It's just a few thoughts about what we've been talking about. If I would say, what is economic history? I think there's really this idea about processes of change over time driven by economics, or the need to produce and consume in various ways. And I think that it makes it different, this effort to understand continuous change and continuity, seeing also continuity as sort of something active actually, and not just passive, differently from historical economics, who would kind of find correlation over time but not really feel the gap in between the two, and different from history by kind of still having even if we do look at microdata, and even if we do look at individuals, we still have a keen eye to structures, because otherwise we can't really follow it over time. And that makes us different compared to history, I think, which is, or social history, that goes really into kind of the details of a specific moment in time, rather than understanding the drivers of change necessarily. And I've thought much about this as having kind of a background in anthropology, where I see also anthropology and ethnology as being these kind of more snapshot examples, and a lot of focus on the details rather than the structures and how structures evolve. So I think that there is something very specific about economic history, different from other disciplines. And what do we then bring that others don't bring? Well, being interested in development issues, I think that we can't kind of understand developing countries' current challenges unless we understand how they ended up where they did end up. I think that we have, like you said, Oskar, we have a lot of things to say about what has happened historically that is relevant for challenges of today. Not saying that history repeats itself exactly the same, but that doesn't mean that there are not lessons from similar processes in the past. So I think that we have a lot to contribute to current debate about politics, social systems, financial systems, development studies, etc., just by that type of understanding how things evolve and change over time. Then I was thinking about this, do we have then theories? Well, me and Erik Gren, we have been arguing this intensely over too much beer. several times, and his point of view is that we are way too non-theoretical, not that we don't use theory, but that we don't create theory ourselves. I think that in the past we have created theory, but I would agree with him that currently we are a bit weak when it comes to developing our own theories. The economists are much stronger on that, and then we kind of pick it up and we adapt it and we fill it with content and empirics and so on. But I think that we could have the ambition of being theoretically stronger in driving the theoretical debate actually than what we are currently. And part of that is I find us to be a very empirical science. So maybe it's just difficult to do everything and doing both. But I think that we are more users and adopters of theory than creators of theory, maybe at the moment. And then with the empirics, I'm not sure if I would say, I mean, obviously we're careful with our sources, but a lot of academics would say that they are careful with their sources and the source criticism and so on. So, but because we are very much into the empirics, we also have to have a lot of source criticism and be careful and aware of our sources. But I'm not sure that it's the best route for us to define us as quantitative or qualitative in that sense. Obviously, there's techniques and methods and so on, but I think that our strength maybe lies in mixing the two and creating something quantitative out of the archival sources. That is not, necessarily high pitch econometrics, but just kind of putting numbers on things and using also qualitative historical sources to understand how we can put numbers or what numbers we can trust and so on. And I think many of us is that what we do. We go into archives, we pull out numbers, and we create something with those, and then we read everything about the context around it. So I would be happy if we thought of ourselves as mixed methods people, maybe rather than one thing or the other. And also true for our department. We're well known for very skilled quantitative research, but I think we also have a lot of qualitative research, and we all have a lot of mixed methods research going on that maybe doesn't signify us as much, and maybe then does not get as much attention as the quantitative studies that come out of Lund. Final thought was that, I mean, now we have a book in Swedish, there's a focus on Sweden, but we also have a lot of international research going on at various different departments, and maybe we could rewrite the book, write a new version of the book in English for a broader international audience, selling our discipline outside of Sweden as well. I don't know. Not to say I think that it's super good to write for the Swedish students. I'm not at all. It's just kind of my, what can we do next?
I support this idea also, as you could imagine. So Sasha, if you want to go next, we have less than 10 minutes, so maybe we can try to have 5 minutes for the two last hands that are up.
All right, I'll keep it brief. It's just actually a comment on the theory discussion. I feel we are using theory very strangely in the field more broadly. To give an example, like I think, somebody was asking a student was asking a colleague, Igor, on economic theory to read, to understand better where certain authors are coming from, including AJR and so on. And it's very hard because they're not really making it clear what is their actual background in terms of like the economic theory approach. And I feel, this broadly in a lot of the recent literature, it's very difficult to know where people coming from. How are we supposed to understand even just like simple supply and demand graphs? I mean, are we seeing aggregate supply and demand, effective supply and demand, or theoretical supply and demand. Just for some example, I think, some more investigation or also teaching of theory, like basic economic theory and so on, is really perhaps lacking or like not given a lot of importance anymore. And especially if we compare this like to older economic history, where it was quite clear where people were coming from, and then it makes a lot more sense. Now you read some Marxist economic history and then you know where this is coming from, and it makes more sense. And now it seems often even theory less empirical work, and then perhaps deriving certain kinds of theories, but they're, I think, different to kind of basic economic theory that we use to understand just market processes and what Ellen said, these problems of production and consumption on this kind of fundamental level. No, that was it.
I don't know if Oskar, you want to react to some of these comments.
Well, we can. Mats had a comment as well, and then I can.
Good idea.
Just shortly, I think we are running out of time. But I think so many wise things have been said here. So, but I think that when we try to define the discipline as such, I think we must search somewhere where Ellen started, the study of economy and society in continuity and in transition, something like that. That must in some way be the basis of defining. And I think that certainly limits us from history as a discipline, because that is very much, of course, but it's more history for history's own sake, so to say, if you understand what I mean. We try to explain something, the big picture, and so on, at least normally. So it's more difficult actually to define ourselves from economics. And my view is that if the neoclassical revolution, the marginalistic revolution by the end of the 19th century hadn't happened, I think economic history wouldn't have been a discipline of its own. I mean, the classical economists, Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, Marx, they asked basically the same questions as we do today about a living society with people of flesh and blood that goes in different categories when it comes to income and classes and everything. So I think that's we in some way we can have them to thank for the race of our discipline. At the same time that we are very eager to use, when it's appropriate, use their toolboxes that they have developed over time. And so maybe that's the problem with our theory. We can't stick to those old guys, Smith and Ricardo and Marx, all the time, and we can't make economics our theory. It's more our toolbox. So it's no wonder that we don't come up with so much for ourselves. Thank you.
So, Clara, could you just comment briefly? Because I think that it was very nice having this discussion with you. I mean, when you invested quite a lot of time in a book project, it's always nice to see what kind of conversations that it can spur and be part of. And I think to a little bit, I very much agree with what Ellen said. How can we find ways of making this conversation to include both the quantitative and the qualitative in a historical setting? Because I think that also, for me at least, it goes to what Sasha said in the beginning about what students do these students actually have. If we, I mean, I can just go to myself when I see where I am, what research projects do I really get engaged in. It's when I have questions or something that I really want, something that I want to understand. And I think this is where we can find the entry point to continuously make economic history, to sort of renew the field, is of course to relate to the old thinkers, but also to relate it to the questions that we have today. And then I think we should be careful of sort of choosing one theory for the other, but rather to make more use of what is this common ground where we can start asking questions, and then we can try to persuade our colleagues that this theory or this method is really good to actually try to answer this question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it was a great conversation, and it feels like you would have to come to Lund, and we would have to continue this around a beer after hour, and it would be nice. So let us know, and I can send an email to the in the name of the seminar to continue the discussion. And thank you for all the comments. I think it was really stimulating conversation. Quite like also the questioning and like the different tools for the question, and in that it can be maybe something also that is quite the essence of economic history, to decide on relevant question and get inspired by history, and then use the toolbox, the most varied toolbox we can. So I think that was a nice way to conclude, and yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and yeah, please let us know for the beer.
Yes, I will do that. Very nice. Thank you. I'd be happy to come.
We'll get Erik Rehn to invite to promote the book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll all keep in touch.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.